A Navy SEAL, you. The sergeant laughed, then regretted it instantly. The sergeant laughed right in his face. Not quietly, not under his breath. He laughed the way men laugh when they think they already know the ending of a story and the ending is embarrassing for someone else. His chest shook. His hand came up to cover his mouth, but not fast enough and not seriously enough because he did not think it needed to be covered. He thought he was being honest. He thought he was doing the boy a favor. Marcus Hayes did not move. He stood in a room full of 63 naval recruits at the processing facility in Coronado, California, and he did not blink, did not shift his weight, did not look at the floor. He was 19 years old. He weighed 161 pounds. He was 5 feet and 10 inches tall, which is not small, but which is not what anyone pictures when they picture a Navy SEAL. His face was the kind of face that people forgot while they were still looking at it, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it offered nothing dramatic. No scar, no jaw like a ship's hull, no eyes that burned with obvious fire. He just looked like a person. Sergeant Dale Cooper had been in the United States Navy for 15 years. He had the chest of a man who had spent those 15 years doing something with his body, and he had the voice of a man who had spent them telling other men what to do with theirs. He was not a bad man, that is important. He was not the kind of man who crushed people for entertainment. He genuinely believed in that moment, standing in that fluorescent-lit room smelling of industrial cleaner and fresh paperwork, that he was being kind. He had seen hundreds of recruits walk through that room. He had seen the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, and after 15 years he believed he could sort them in the first 30 seconds. Height, shoulders, the way a man held his chin when someone of rank looked at him directly, the small signals that the body sends before the mind has decided anything. Marcus Hayes sent none of them. So when the officer at the front of the room asked which recruits were submitting applications for basic underwater demolition and SEAL training, and Marcus took one step forward, Sergeant Dale Cooper laughed. And the room felt it. Not every man in that room laughed, most of them did not, but the ones who did not laugh still felt the shift in the air, the way the temperature of a space changes when something uncomfortable happens. Shoulders went stiff, eyes went sideways. A few recruits near the back studied their own boots with sudden, intense interest. One recruit, a broad-shouldered young man named Owen Clark, who had been a state wrestling champion in Ohio and who had privately also stepped forward to submit his SEAL application, looked at Marcus with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite embarrassment. It was somewhere between the two. He would remember that look later. He would think about it for years. Marcus picked up the pen from the table in front of him. He filled out the BUD/S application form with the handwriting of a man who was not in a hurry. Clean letters, straight lines. He did not press too hard and he did not write too lightly. When he was finished, he set the pen back on the table. The sound it made was small, almost nothing. He stepped back into line. Sergeant Cooper had already moved on, walking the length of the room, talking about processing schedules and physical evaluations. He had forgotten Marcus Hayes in approximately the time it takes to forget a face that offers nothing to hold on to. Marcus had not forgotten him. But here is the thing about Marcus Hayes that nobody in that room knew, because he had not told anyone and he did not intend to. He was not angry, not in the way people expect, not with heat. Anger with heat burns fast and collapses into exhaustion, and Marcus had learned long before Coronado that exhaustion was a luxury he could not afford. What he had instead was something colder, something that had been compressed by years into a shape so dense it no longer needed air to stay lit. He had grown up in a town in Alabama called Harlan's Creek. The name made it sound like a place with character, and it did have character, the kind that comes from being poor long enough that poverty stops feeling like a temporary condition and starts feeling like weather. His father, Gene Hayes, worked at a lumber yard. His mother, Carol Hayes, cleaned rooms at a motel 40 minutes from their house 3 days a week and took in laundry the other days. They were not people who complained. That was the thing Marcus always came back to when he thought about them. They were not people who sat around the dinner table cataloging their disappointments. His father came home tired and washed his hands and sat down and ate and asked Marcus how school was. His mother hummed while she folded other people's clothes. They moved through hard days the way rivers move through stone, not dramatically, just continuously. Marcus was 12 years old the first time a teacher told him he was smart, not because teachers had not noticed before, but because in Harlan's Creek the word smart was not always a compliment. Smart meant you thought you were better than where you came from. Smart meant you were going to be disappointed. The teacher who said it, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Ford, said it quietly, after class, in a way that felt like a warning disguised as encouragement, and Marcus had nodded and walked home and thought about it for 3 days. He decided she was right, and he decided it was not a warning. He read everything he could reach. He ran every morning before school because he had read that physical discipline and mental discipline were the same thing approached from different directions, and he wanted both. He did not talk about his plans. In Harlan's Creek, talking about plans was how plans died. People would look at you with kindness and say things that were meant to be realistic, and the kindness and the realism together would plant a small seed of doubt, and doubt was the thing Marcus could not afford. So he ran, he read, he stayed quiet. When he was 16, he found a book at the public library about the Navy SEALs. It was not a romantic book. It was a straightforward account of the training, the selection process, the physical and mental demands. It described men going into cold water in the middle of the night and staying there until their bodies wanted to stop working. It described men being given impossible tasks with insufficient time and being evaluated not on whether they completed the tasks, but on how they behaved when they could not. Marcus read that book twice. He returned it to the library, checked it out again 2 weeks later, and read it a third time. He was not drawn to the idea of SEALs because of glory. He was not interested in glory. He was interested in the selection process itself, in the specific, verifiable fact that the training was designed to find the thing inside a person that does not quit even when quitting is the logical choice. He wanted to know if he had that thing. He was fairly certain he did. He wanted to be sure. He told his mother on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table while she mended a tear in a shirt that did not belong to either of them. She set the shirt down. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're going to need to eat more." That was the whole conversation. His father heard about it at dinner 2 days later because his mother told him in the way that married people tell each other things, between sentences about other things, quietly, as if it were simply a piece of information and not a declaration. His father passed the salt to Marcus and said, "I'll drive you to the recruiter's office Saturday." He did. Marcus spent the next 2.5 years preparing. He swam in the river outside Harlan's Creek in every season, including the season when the water made his hands stop working properly after 10 minutes. He ran trails in the dark. He studied for the ASVAB, which is the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, and scored high enough that the recruiter looked at his score, looked at him, looked at his score again. He did push-ups until his arms were useless, and then waited for them to recover and did more. He did not talk about any of it. When he arrived at Coronado at 19 years old and stepped forward in that room, he had been preparing for that step for 2.5 years. He had run more miles than he had counted. He had been in cold water so many times that cold water had stopped being a shock and had become simply a condition. Sergeant Dale Cooper looked at him and saw a thin, quiet boy from nowhere in particular. He laughed. Marcus set the pen down. Outside the processing facility, the Pacific Ocean ran along the edge of the sand with complete indifference. It did not care about Cooper's laugh or Marcus's silence. It did not care about applications or opinions or the particular weight of being dismissed by someone with authority. It was just water. Marcus had been thinking about it since he walked off the plane. He was ready. The other recruits filed out of the room in clusters, talking about the schedule, about the evaluation, about what they had heard about Bud S. from friends who had tried and failed. Owen Clark fell into step beside Marcus without saying anything for a long moment and then said, "You know what you're getting into." Marcus looked at him. "Yes," he said. Owen Clark nodded slowly. He would later say, in a conversation with a fellow operator years after this day, that the way Marcus said that single word was the most certain sound he had heard in his life up to that point. Not loud, not aggressive, just settled. The way a stone is settled at the bottom of a river, it has been there, it intends to stay. They walked out into the California sun together, two young men who had each, in their own way, decided something, and the decision was the kind that does not need to be announced to be real. The ocean was still there when they stepped outside. It always was. And somewhere inside the building, Sergeant Dale Cooper was writing names on a clipboard, having already forgotten the quiet boy from Alabama, having already moved on to the business of the day. He would remember him later. He would have no choice. The water arrived before anyone was ready for it. That is the thing about Bud S. that nobody fully communicates in the books or the documentaries or the accounts told by men at dinner tables to people who have never been cold in a meaningful way. The water does not wait for you to be mentally prepared. It does not give you a moment to gather yourself. One minute you're standing on wet sand in the dark, and the next minute the Pacific Ocean is inside your ears and your nose and the collar of your uniform, and the cold is not a temperature. It is a decision the ocean is making about your body, and your body has not been consulted. Marcus Hayes hit the water on the first morning of Hell Week at 2:14 in the morning. Hell Week is the crucible at the center of Bud-S training. It lasts 5.5 days. During those 5.5 days, SEAL candidates are allowed approximately 4 hours of sleep in total. They are cold for most of it. They are wet for all of it. They are given tasks that are physically brutal under normal conditions and are nearly impossible under conditions of no sleep, constant cold, and bodies that have been working at maximum effort for days at a stretch. The design is not sadistic. That is another thing the books try to explain and never quite succeed at. The design is diagnostic. It is not trying to break men. It is trying to find out which men can function when everything in their body and their mind is telling them to stop, because the job they are training for requires exactly that. It requires men who can operate at the edge of human capacity and still make good decisions, still think, still lead, still choose correctly when incorrect choices are much easier. The bell sat at the edge of the training compound on a wooden post. It was brass. It hung at shoulder height. To ring it, you grabbed the rope attached to the clapper and pulled. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was a plain, clear ring. When a candidate rang it, he set his helmet down in the sand beside the post, and an instructor walked him inside, and that was the end of his Bud-S attempt. In the first 24 hours of Hell Week, 19 men rang the bell. Marcus watched each one go. He did not watch with judgment. He watched the way you watch, whether moving across a landscape, observing, noting. Storing. He was cold. He was the same temperature as everyone else in the water. His hands had stopped feeling like his hands at some point during the second hour of surf conditioning and had become instead two heavy objects attached to his wrists that he had to remember to use intentionally. His legs worked. His mind was sharp, which surprised him and also did not surprise him, because he had spent years building the habit of thinking clearly in discomfort. His name at Bud-S was not Hayes. His name was Hey-You, which is what the instructors called every candidate who had not yet distinguished himself enough to earn being called by name. Instructors learned your name one of two ways. They learned it because you were performing exceptionally well. Or they learned it because you were performing exceptionally poorly. By day 2, the instructors knew Marcus's name. Not because of exceptional performance in any single evolution. His run times were good, not spectacular. His swim times were strong. His performance in log PT, which is a group exercise involving carrying a log that weighs approximately 400 pounds with a team of 6 men, was steady and efficient. But it was not the performance numbers that made instructor Gary Webb stop and look at his clipboard and look at Marcus and then look at the clipboard again. It was the face. In 22 hours of Hell Week, Marcus Hayes had not changed his expression once. Not grimace, not determination, the exaggerated kind that men perform when they want to be seen enduring. Not vacant, the 1,000-yard stare that some candidates develop when their mind begins to detach from the suffering. His face was just his face, present, attentive, the same face he had worn when he filled out the application form in the processing room and set the pen down. Webb pointed him out to another instructor, a man named Frank Dorsey, who had been running Bud-S candidates through Hell Week for 6 years. "Watch that one," Webb said. Dorsey watched. What Dorsey saw over the next 4 days was not a man who was immune to pain. He saw a man who had clearly decided, at some point prior to arriving at Coronado, that pain was information and not instruction, that it could tell you things about your body without being allowed to tell your body what to do. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. It is the entire difference. On day 3, an evolution called around the world put Marcus and his boat crew in the Pacific Ocean for an extended open water paddle in inflatable rubber boats in conditions that were cold and rough and uncooperative. 2 members of his boat crew were fading. Marcus could see it in the way they held their paddles, the grip going loose, the eyes going distant, the subtle shift in posture that means a person is spending more energy on survival than on the task. He did not give a speech. He did not perform leadership for the instructors watching from the beach. He paddled harder. He adjusted his position to compensate for the men who were fading. He said in a voice flat enough to sound like conversation, "Left side push." That was it, 2 words. The men on the left side pushed. The boat moved. His boat crew completed the evolution. Neither of the men who had been fading rang the bell that day. Whether that was because of Marcus or because they found something in themselves that had nothing to do with Marcus, it is impossible to say. Marcus would not have claimed credit either way. Owen Clark was still in it. Owen had turned out to be exactly what he looked like, which was a man built from the materials of someone who was supposed to succeed at this. He was strong, he was fast, his recovery time between evolutions was remarkable. He slept 4 actual minutes in the first 40 hours of Hell Week, which sounds impossible and is nearly impossible, but which his body managed because his body was built for it. But Owen was loud about it. Not complaining loud in the way of a man who narrates his own struggle as a way of processing it. Come on, he would say under his breath during physical evolutions, talking himself through it, coaching himself forward. It worked for him. His method was valid. He was still in the water on day 3, still paddling, still running, still functional. But Marcus noticed that the men who talked to themselves the most were also the men who rang the bell the most often. Not always, but often enough. He said nothing about this to anyone. On day 4, the instructors introduced an evolution designed specifically for psychological pressure. They gave each boat crew an impossible task, a construction challenge involving rope and wooden poles on the beach that could not be completed in the allotted time no matter how efficiently the crew worked. The point was not the task. The point was the failure. They wanted to see what men did when they worked hard and correctly and still failed. Some crews fell apart. Arguments started. Blame moved around the group looking for somewhere to land. Marcus's crew did not fall apart. He organized them, divided the task into components. They did not finish. They were not close to finishing. But when the time ran out and the instructor called stop, every man in Marcus's crew was still working, still moving, still treating the impossible task as if it were merely a difficult one. Webb made a note. On the night of day 4, during a 2-hour window that was the closest thing to rest that Hell Week provided, Marcus sat on wet sand with his back against a wall and did not sleep. Not because he could not, he probably could have briefly. He did not sleep because he wanted to stay inside the experience. He wanted to feel exactly where his body was and where his mind was and what the distance between them felt like, because he had been curious about this his entire life and now he was in it, and he intended to be fully awake for every part of it. He thought about his mother mending the shirt. He thought about the river outside Harlan's Creek in January. He thought about Sergeant Cooper's laugh, but briefly, the way you think about a thing that has already been settled. He was not angry. He was interested. Day 5 arrived the way all days arrive in Hell Week, which is without ceremony or transition, 1 minute being night and the next minute being a slightly different shade of dark that eventually became gray. The cold did not change. The water did not change. The number of remaining candidates had changed significantly. Out of 63 men who had begun, 31 were still in it. Marcus Hayes was one of them. Owen Clark was another. There were young men from places Marcus had never been and backgrounds he would never fully understand, and they were all reduced, by 5 days of the same experience, to the same essential question: how much of yourself can you spend before there is nothing left to spend? Marcus had an answer to that question. He had been forming it for years before anyone told him the question existed. The answer was not a number, it was not a distance or a time, it was a practice, a habit of returning every time he wanted to stop to the single, clear fact of why he had come. Not to prove Sergeant Cooper wrong. That was not it, that had never been it. He had come because he wanted to know the outermost edge of himself. He had come because the life he had grown up in had given him one enormous, useful gift, which was the knowledge that discomfort was survivable, and he wanted to find out exactly how survivable. He wanted to find the wall. He had not found it yet. The bell at the edge of the compound rang twice more before Hell Week was officially secured. Both times, Marcus heard it the way you hear distant traffic, present, acknowledged, irrelevant to the direction he was going. When the instructors finally called the end of Hell Week, they did it without ceremony. They said the words, and the men who remained stood in a line on the beach, and the Pacific Ocean behind them went on being the Pacific Ocean, indifferent and enormous and unchanged. Marcus Hayes stood in that line. His hands were shaking. His legs had a vibration in them that he could feel but could not entirely control. His face was the same as it had always been. One of the instructors, Frank Dorsey, walked the line. He stopped in front of Marcus. He looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than the moments he gave the other candidates. He said nothing. He moved on. But that pause was the most important thing that had happened to Marcus Hayes since he had set the pen down on the table in the processing room. Because Dorsey had looked at him and seen something he had not expected to see when he watched a wiry, unremarkable young man from Alabama step forward in a fluorescent-lit room 3 weeks earlier. He had seen someone who had not been surprised by any of it. Not by the cold, not by the no sleep, not by the impossible tasks or the constant failure or the ocean or the bell or the attrition or the weight of 5 days of everything a human body dreads most about being alive. Marcus Hayes had come to Hell Week prepared. Not prepared the way athletes prepare, with training plans and nutrition and performance metrics. Prepared the way a person who has already decided is prepared from the inside, prepared in the specific, unspectacular way of someone who has been practicing the most important skill in Bud S training his entire life without knowing that was what he was doing. The skill of continuing. The Pacific was flat that morning, the kind of flat that happens sometimes after a storm when the ocean seems to exhale. The light was coming in low and orange from the east, hitting the water at an angle that made it look like something solid, something you could walk on if you were the kind of person who did not need the ground beneath them to behave like ground. Marcus looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned away. There was more to do. The trident does not look like what you expect. It is a pin about 2¼ inches wide, made of gold-colored metal, depicting an eagle holding a trident and an anchor and a flintlock pistol. It sits on the chest of every Navy SEAL. It is heavy for its size, which is deliberate. It is earned rather than given, which is also deliberate, but the earning of it by the time you're standing at the graduation ceremony in Coronado feels almost impossible to fully contain in your mind, because the distance between the person who showed up at the beginning and the person who is standing there at the end is not a distance that can be measured in weeks or evolutions or cold water. It is measured in a different unit entirely. Marcus Hayes stood in a formation of 31 men on a bright California afternoon in a ceremony that was quiet by military standards. There was no marching band, there was no excessive theater. There were families in the bleachers, people who had been waiting through months of not quite knowing, of phone calls that said things were going and didn't say how, of sleeping in their own beds while someone they loved slept on cold sand. Carol Hayes had driven 14 hours from Alabama. She sat in the third row of the bleachers in a blue dress and shoes that she wore to church, which was her way of saying this was the most important thing that had happened in the Hayes family's living memory. She had brought a casserole and a covered dish in a bag on the floor at her feet, because Carol Hayes's response to anything that mattered was to make sure someone was fed, and she did not fully trust California to provide an adequate meal. She was the only person in the bleachers with a casserole. She did not find this embarrassing. The concept of being embarrassed by feeding people was foreign to her. Gene Hayes sat beside her. He was in his good shirt, which he had ironed himself that morning in the motel room. He had not said much on the drive from Alabama. He had driven the first 7 hours while Carol slept, and then Carol had driven the last 7 while Gene sat in the passenger seat looking at the country going by. And once, somewhere in Texas, he had said quietly to the window, "He did it," and Carol had said, "I know," and that had been the whole conversation, and it had been enough. The ceremony began. The officer at the front spoke about the history of naval special warfare. He spoke about what the trident represented. He spoke in the measured, serious way of a man who has seen both what the training asks and what the job asks, and who understands that the distance between them is also significant. Marcus stood in the formation and listened. He was not thinking about Sergeant Cooper. He had not thought about Cooper in weeks. This is a fact worth sitting with because people who tell underdog stories often make the antagonist a constant presence, a face the hero sees when they are suffering, a voice that drives them forward. That is a satisfying story structure. It is not what happened. What drove Marcus forward had nothing to do with Cooper. Cooper had been a moment, a data point. A man who looked at a picture and read it the way most people would read it and came to a conclusion that most people would come to. The laugh had not wounded Marcus in any lasting way because Marcus's belief in himself had not been built on the foundation of other people's opinions of him. It was built on something else. On years of cold rivers and dark trails, and a book borrowed 3 times from a public library, and a mother who said, "You'll need to eat more," and meant it as the fullest possible expression of faith. He stood in the formation, and the California sun was warm on his face, and the Pacific was behind the facility doing what it always did. Owen Clark stood 2 men to his left. Owen had made it. He had been extraordinary in the water, precisely as his body had always promised he would be. He had developed somewhere in the back half of training a quality Marcus had noticed but not expected, the ability to go quiet, to pull the narration inward. He had stopped saying, "Come on, come on, come on," during evolution sometime around week 6, and what replaced it was a concentration so focused it was visible from outside him. He had become, in the months of training, a different version of himself, which is what the training is designed to produce. He caught Marcus's eye once during the ceremony and gave a small nod. Marcus returned it. When the time came for the trident to be pinned, the process was not a pinning in the traditional sense. The trident was placed on the chest and then pressed, hard, by the hand of a senior officer, hard enough that the pins on the back of it pressed into the skin through the uniform. This was not accidental. The trident was supposed to leave a mark. It was supposed to be felt. Every man who wore one was supposed to know from the first moment of wearing it that it had cost something to put there. Marcus felt the pressure. He did not flinch. The officer pressing the trident into his chest was a man named Commander Alan Briggs, who had been a SEAL for 18 years and who had seen many graduation ceremonies, and who was not a sentimental man by profession or habit. He pressed the trident and looked at Marcus, and there was a brief exchange that was entirely without words but which both men understood. Alan Briggs had read Marcus's training file. He knew the numbers, the run times, the swim times, the evolution scores. He knew the notes that Webb and Dorsey had made. He knew that at no point in any recorded assessment had Marcus Hayes been the top performer in his class. He had never been first across a finish line in a race against 30 other men who were also motivated and also physically capable. What he had been was never second to last, never faltering, never the one the instructors thought about when they thought about attrition risk. He had been the one who made the instructors stop and ask the question they found most interesting, not can he keep up, but where does he stop? They had never found the answer. Briggs stepped back, moved to the next man in the line. Marcus did not exhale dramatically. He did not let his shoulders drop. He was standing in a formation, and the formation had a posture requirement, and he met it. But something changed in him in that moment in a way that was entirely internal, in a way that had no outward expression at all. He had come to find out if he had the thing. He had found out. After the ceremony in the parking lot outside the facility, Carol Hayes stood with her casserole dish and waited. She had watched the whole thing from the bleachers with the careful attention of a woman who has survived hard years by paying close attention to the world around her. She had watched her son stand in the formation. She had watched the trident being pressed into his chest. She had watched him not flinch. She had known he would not flinch. Gene Hayes stood beside her with his hands in the pockets of his good trousers, looking at the facility, looking at the families coming out, looking for Marcus. Marcus came out in a group of 3 other new operators, all of them in uniform, all of them carrying the particular quality of men who have been through something together that they will never quite be able to explain to someone who has not been through it. Not trauma exactly, though there are elements of that, more like shared translation, like they now all speak a language that has no textbook and no classroom. He saw his parents. He walked toward them. Carol Hayes did not run to him. She was not a running sort of woman in emotional moments. She walked toward him in her church shoes with the same steady pace she used for everything else in her life. When she reached him, she put one hand on his face briefly, the way you touch something to make sure it is real, and then she put both arms around him and held on for the length of time it takes to say everything you cannot say. Gene Hayes put one hand on his son's shoulder, once, firmly, then dropped it. "Proud of you," he said. 3 words. Marcus nodded. They stood in the California sun for a moment, 3 people from Harlan's Creek, Alabama, in a parking lot in Coronado, and the moment was large enough to hold everything it needed to hold without any of them having to name it. Carol reached into the bag and produced the casserole dish. "There's a microwave in the motel," she said. Marcus looked at the casserole dish. Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile and was more than an expression. It was the particular face of a person who loves someone so completely that the specific absurdity of being handed a casserole in a parking lot after the most significant moment of their life only makes the love larger. "Okay," he said. They walked to the car. Sergeant Dale Cooper was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia at that moment, 3,000 miles away, filling out requisition forms and running a class of new recruits through something entirely unrelated to the processing room in Coronado, where he had laughed at a quiet boy from Alabama 6 months earlier. He did not know about the ceremony. He did not know about the tridents. He did not know that the thin young man who had set the pen down on the table without looking at him had spent 6 months in the water and on the sand and in the dark, and had come out the other side of it wearing something on his chest that very few people in the world will ever wear. He would find out in 6 weeks. And it would cost him something. Not his career, not his rank, not anything external. Something internal. The specific, uncomfortable cost of realizing that you looked at a person and read them wrong, not maliciously, not carelessly. You looked at them with 15 years of experience and a genuine desire to be useful, and you read them wrong completely, and the wrongness of your reading was total. That cost does not go away, it sits with you. It sat with Dale Cooper. He had it coming. The thing about being wrong at that level is that it does not announce itself. It arrives the way most uncomfortable truths arrive, sideways, through someone else's casual mention, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. You are standing in a hallway or sitting at a desk or walking between buildings, and someone says something, and the thing they say reaches into your chest and rearranges something in there, and afterward the hallway or the desk or the buildings look slightly different from how they looked before. That was how it happened for Dale Cooper. He was in a corridor at the Naval Facility in Norfolk on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, talking with a fellow petty officer named Stan Weller about a logistics matter that was not interesting enough to remember. They were walking and talking the way men do, when neither the walking nor the talking is particularly urgent. The conversation shifted, the way conversations shift, from the logistics matter to something Weller had heard from a friend at Coronado, which was about the latest Bud S graduating class. Weller was not telling the story about Marcus Hayes specifically. He was talking generally about the class, about the attrition rate, about 1 or 2 candidates who had stood out. He mentioned Marcus the way you mention a thing that is interesting rather than significant. There was one from Alabama, Weller said. Nobody saw him coming, made it through Hell Week without the instructors being able to find his edge. Webb and Dorsey both made notes on him. Apparently he looked the same going in and coming out. Cooper was half listening. What was the name? He said. Weller thought for a moment. Hayes, Marcus Hayes. Cooper stopped walking. Not dramatically, not like a man in a film who stops and turns and makes a face. He stopped in the practical, involuntary way of a man whose body has received information and needs a moment to process it before continuing to operate. Hayes, he said. You know him. Cooper was quiet for a moment. The corridor was the same corridor it had always been, fluorescent light, linoleum floor, the smell of institutional buildings everywhere. No, he said. Which was technically true. He did not know Marcus Hayes. He had spent approximately 45 seconds looking at him. He had spent approximately 2 of those seconds laughing. Weller moved on to something else. Cooper walked with him. He said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments for the rest of the conversation. His mouth was functioning. His mind was somewhere in a processing room in Coronado, standing in front of a table, watching a thin young man from nowhere in particular fill out a form with careful handwriting and set a pen down. He had laughed. The memory of it was not pleasant to revisit. This is the thing about Dale Cooper that matters and that is easy to miss if you turn him into a simple villain. He was not the kind of man who was comfortable with being wrong, not because his ego could not handle it. He had been wrong before. He had said things in his career that he later walked back, and he had done it without difficulty, because the wrongness had been about opinions or strategies or calls in the field. Those kinds of wrong are correctable. You make a different call next time. This was different. This was about a person. He had looked at a person and dismissed them in public in front of 62 witnesses, and the person had gone and done the exact thing he had implied was beyond them, and had done it not barely squeaking through, but in a way that made experienced instructors stop and make notes. That is a specific kind of wrong. It has a weight. Cooper spent the following days doing what men like Cooper do when something uncomfortable enters their thinking. He worked. He ran his recruits. He filed his paperwork. He ate his meals at regulation times and slept at regulation hours. From the outside, nothing had changed. But the thing was in him now. He thought about the pen, the way it had been set down, not thrown, not slapped, set, with the quietness of a man who has no need to perform his feelings for an audience. He thought about the 62 other men in that room. Some of them had probably heard the laugh and felt relief that the attention was on someone else. Some had probably felt the low, uncomfortable thing that witnesses feel when they watch an embarrassment happen to someone who did not deserve it. He wondered how many of them had put Marcus's name with the laugh and remembered it when they heard about the graduation. He suspected more than one. 6 weeks after the conversation with Weller in the corridor, Dale Cooper requested Marcus Hayes's service information through proper channels. He was entitled to do this within the bounds of his position. He read the file. He read the training notes from Webb and Dorsey. He read the performance assessments. He read the number that told him how many men had started Bud S in that class and how many had finished. 187 men had started. 31 had finished. Marcus Hayes was one of 31. Cooper set the file down on his desk. He looked at the wall of his office for a moment, which was not a habit of his. He was not the sort of man who stared at walls. He was a man of action and forward motion and practical thinking. But he sat there for a moment and looked at the wall and thought about what it costs a person to do what Marcus Hayes had done. Not the physical cost, though he understood that better than most. The other cost, the cost of going into a room and being laughed at by a man with authority and saying nothing and continuing. The cost of preparing for years in a town that probably did not have much infrastructure for that kind of preparation. The cost of being quiet about it, of not announcing it, of simply showing up and doing it. He had met many impressive men in 15 years. He had not often been on the wrong side of impressive. He made a decision. He requested a brief meeting. It took 2 weeks to arrange because Cooper was in Norfolk and Marcus was at his first posting, which was a facility in Virginia Beach, not far but not close. The meeting was scheduled through official channels and was officially described as a welfare check, which is a routine category of meeting in the Navy and which raised no flags and required no explanation. They met in a small room at the Virginia Beach facility. A table, 4 chairs, a window with a view of a parking lot, the kind of room that exists in every military facility and has no personality whatsoever. Marcus came in and sat across from Cooper. He was in uniform. He looked, Cooper observed, essentially the same as he had looked in the processing room, slightly more weight on him, the same face. The same quality of offering nothing that was not requested. Cooper looked at him for a moment. "I want to say something," Cooper said. Marcus waited. "I was wrong," Cooper said. "What I did in that room was wrong. The way I responded to you stepping forward, I was wrong about you. I want you to know I understand that." He said it the way a man says something he has been composing for several weeks, directly, without decoration, not apologetic in the way of a man trying to make himself feel better, but accountable in the way of a man who believes that accountability means saying the true thing plainly and then living with whatever comes after. Marcus looked at him. He did not lean forward. He did not let the moment swell into something dramatic. He looked at Cooper across the table in the small room with the parking lot outside the window, and he took the measure of the man sitting there, and what he saw was not what he had expected to see. He had expected, in the weeks since he had heard through channels that Cooper wanted to meet, some version of defensiveness, some version of a man who wanted to reframe the laugh as something other than what it was. He had prepared himself for a conversation that required him to be gracious in the face of excuse-making. This was not that. Cooper was not making excuses. He was just sitting there with what he had done, and it was visible on him, and he was not trying to hide it. Marcus extended his hand across the table. Cooper took it. "Thank you, Sergeant," Marcus said. Cooper nodded once. They talked for a few minutes after that, not about the laugh or the training or anything charged. They talked about Virginia Beach, about the transition from training to an actual posting, practical things, the conversation of 2 military men being professional. When Marcus stood to leave, Cooper stayed seated. "Hayes," he said. Marcus paused. "You went further than anyone expected," Cooper said. "That means something." Marcus looked at him. "I know," he said. He turned and walked out. Cooper sat in the room for a moment after the door closed. The parking lot outside the window was gray and flat and entirely unremarkable. A few vehicles, a fence line, the kind of view that belongs to the kinds of rooms where things get settled without any witnesses. He had done what he came to do. He felt better, which he had not been sure he would, not absolved. Better was not absolution. It was the particular feeling of having carried something heavy and then setting it down properly, not dropping it, not throwing it away, but actually setting it down in the right place with both hands. He sat for another minute. Then he stood and straightened his uniform and walked out. Marcus was already gone. He was back in the corridor of his own building by the time Cooper reached the main exit of the facility. He was thinking about the next week, about his posting, about the work ahead, which was the kind of work he had spent years preparing to do and which now finally was real, not training, not preparation, the actual thing. He was not thinking about the meeting. He was not thinking about the laugh. Those things had been real and they had mattered, and they had shaped something in him the way all hard things shape the people they happened to, but they were not the story he was living. They were the beginning of the story, the part that establishes what a person is made of before the real demands begin. The trident was on his chest. He had found his edge. It was further than anyone had been able to see from the outside. Sergeant Dale Cooper had looked at him in that room and seen the outside of him, the surface, the wiry young man from nowhere in particular with nothing dramatic in his face, and he had made the mistake that people make when they believe they can see the inside of a person by looking at the outside. Marcus did not hold it against him. He never had, really. He just went and proved the inside was the part that mattered. In Harlan's Creek, Alabama, in a house that had weathered things and was still standing, Carol Hayes had a photograph on the refrigerator. It was taken in the parking lot in Coronado in the California sun, 3 people from a small town standing with a casserole dish and a great deal of unspoken things. Marcus was in the center. He was not smiling in the photograph exactly. But he was not smiling either. He looked like someone who had been somewhere and come back carrying proof. Gene Hayes passed that photograph every morning on his way to the coffee pot and every evening on his way to the table. He never said anything about it. He did not need to. He had driven his son to the recruiter's office on a Saturday morning and shaken his hand and gotten back in the truck and driven home, and that had been the beginning of it. This photograph was not the end of it. But it was proof that the beginning had been the right call. It had always been the right call. Marcus Hayes had simply been the only one who knew it from the start.